Hey, good morning, everybody. Good to see you all again. Hey, if you're tuning in online right now, again, good morning to you. Good to have you in the room. Hey, I want to encourage you. This may be the summer for you to vacation differently. And so if you do have kids, you're raising a family at this point, and then we're talking all the way from birth all the way through high school, man, I'd encourage you, check out family camp. It's going to be in early June, so it's kind of happening right on the front end of your summer vacation, and it is about having fun, and it is about spending time together, but it's about creating memories, breaking away from your normal everyday stuff, and we always want to set parents up to succeed, to be primary spiritual trainers in their homes. And so to that end, we want to help you start conversations, maybe jump into some topics and discussions that you're not going to do in your everyday life at home. And so you can do that when you break away and get to family camp. Listen, all the information, I'm going to tell you where to find it. Go on to our events page. So go to BeFearless.org. Right here, you'll find an events tab, and you're actually going to find 2 events on there for family camp. And here's why. Because you can attend, and so you can find all the information. You can register and attend family camp. But if you're sitting here today and you say, hey, I'm not going to attend family camp, but I would love to jump in and help, serve families, serve our kids, serve our students, we would love to have you jump in and volunteer. So there's actually a whole volunteer sign up as well. You can find out more information about what that looks like, and you can not only be a person that vacations differently, you can help someone else do that. So we'd love to have you. Check it all out today. All right. We're going to jump back into our teaching series. I'm going to catch you all up, though, real quick. Maybe you're newer to Fearless Church, kind of walking in the room, could be the first time here. Maybe you've been away for a little while. Here's what we're doing. We are spending time in this ongoing series called Jesus, More Than a Man. And what we're trying to do is figure out what are the different aspects of Jesus and who he truly was. And so during this series, we're focusing specifically on things recorded by one of the gospel writers. His name was Luke. If you ever opened up a Bible and you look in the New Testament, there are 4 what we call Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And all of those people wrote down and recorded an account of who Jesus was and many of the things that he did. And today we're actually going to look at a story, a very short story written by Luke, about a man who was at one point written off. And when I say written off, I mean utterly disregarded by the people around him, abandoned, and essentially given up on. And I wonder if some of you know what that feels like. Have you ever been written off before? You ever been written off before by someone? In other words, have you ever been discounted? You ever been set aside by someone? Maybe truly given up on? Maybe it was a teacher way back early somewhere in your school days and you had that one class that you didn't understand. And you didn't keep up and you didn't want to keep up and you didn't get it figured out and the teacher finally just kind of set you somewhere off to the side and you felt discounted. It might have been a coach for you at one point. You dropped the ball, literally dropped the ball, right? Maybe lost the game, cost your team, and you were on the court. Next thing you know, you were on the sidelines, and then you were on the bench, and then you never saw meaningful minutes again. You literally were written out of the script. It could have been a first date. Maybe you finally drummed up the idea of, I'm going to ask him out, I'm going to ask her out, and so you did. So you went out for your first drink, your first cup of coffee, your first movie, and then they disappeared forever. And after an hour and a half, they wrote you off, and you still don't know why. It might be more significant. Maybe it was a parent, someone close to you in your home that kind of wrote you off. Maybe you never quite fit up to the expectations that you think they had for you. Maybe you let someone down. You broke some trust, and they kind of gave up on you, and your relationship has simply never really recovered. It might be a spouse, a former spouse, didn't do as well as you could have done in that relationship. Went through a rough patch. Maybe you tried to repair some things, but at that point they just said, we're not giving you a second chance. I'm not giving you a second chance. I'm done. Walking away. No more. I wonder if the church has ever given up on you. Have you ever felt written off by the church? Written off by someone in the church? And yeah, maybe you did some things wrong. Maybe there's some things you believed that you shouldn't have believed, but at some point you walked away from the church feeling abandoned, feeling left behind in some way. Listen, no matter the circumstance, big or small, no one wants to feel written off. No one wants to be written off by someone else. And today we're going to look at this story, again, of someone, a man, who was written off. He knew firsthand what it felt like to be disregarded, to be given up on by the people around him. And today's story is interesting. It's unique just to the gospel writer Luke. This is the only place we find it. And it's sort of a famous story because it feels like it gets taught in Sunday school classes all the time. And even if you have no church background, maybe you don't know anything about the Bible, you might know the name. Because today we're going to talk about this guy right up here. His name is Zacchaeus. And I don't know what comes to mind when you hear that name Zacchaeus. I do know there's not a lot of parents naming their kids after him. I've never met a Zacchaeus in my life. Some of you, I think I heard it. If you go way back to your Sunday school days, there was actually a song written about this guy. Yeah, some of you are nodding. You're going to sing it with me. Here's how it goes. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. Done. All right. That's all I got. The only thing worse than being written off, right, is being forever remembered in a song as a wee little man. That will give you a complex right there. But this is a feel-good story. I don't know if people know. It's a feel-good story, and here's why. Because it's a story about a guy, kind of an underdog. He takes a chance. And because he takes a chance, he encounters Jesus. And when he encounters Jesus, it actually changes everything. And Luke records just this short story in Luke 19. We find out that Zacchaeus lives in this city of Jericho. It says that Jesus entered Jericho, he was passing through. Jesus had left Galilee. He was headed south down through this region of Samaria, kind of had his crew with him. Word about him was starting to spread a bit. He was on his way to a very important city, Jerusalem, but on the way he stopped here in Jericho, and it says that there was a man there by the name of Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. And that's kind of a redundant statement, because a chief tax collector would absolutely be wealthy. That man would have been at the top of the collection pyramid. Most likely had people collecting taxes underneath him as well. So he would take taxes, but also commissions from others. And the great part about his job is because of his position, he could overcharge or charge really whatever he wanted. So to the point of corruption and the abuse of power, he could fleece people out of their money. And he made a living doing that in this city of Jericho. And he would take advantage of others. He was untouchable. And to say that he would have been unpopular in that town would have been a huge understatement. He was public enemy number one. But as Jesus wandered into town, he, like many other people, he was curious. He was curious. It says he wanted to see who Jesus was. But because he was short, we've already covered that. Listen, I'm not throwing any rocks, all right? He was a short man. He couldn't see over the crowd. He ran ahead. It said he climbed the sycamore fig tree. It's kind of like this oak tree. It's got like a squat trunk, and it would have these big branches. And you picture this man of his stature or whatever. He's climbing up this tree and finds his way up into this thing because Jesus was coming that way. And it says that when Jesus reached that spot, he looked up at Zacchaeus and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." And at first I thought, well, I don't know how he knows this guy's name. And then I thought, I'm not sure how he knew where he was, because he's climbing, he's hiding up in a tree, he's not wanting to be seen. But the bigger issue is that Jesus just invited himself over. I mean, you catch that, right? Like Zacchaeus did not say, "Hey, do you want to come over?" Jesus said, "I am coming over. I'm coming to your house today." And we can't miss that, because that's actually a really big deal. In that day, it was not like Jesus was saying to Zacchaeus, "Hey, you want to grab some lunch?" Or it's not like, "Hey, let's get a drink after work." No, that's not the connotation there. Going to someone's home in that particular culture, in that way, it signified something. It signified an act of relationship, a deep level of fellowship. It would have said there's some measure of acceptance, one to the other, the guest and the host at that moment. And it says that Zacchaeus did what? He came down at once, and he welcomed Jesus gladly. And it says all the people saw this, and they began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." And they knew that to be true, because they all know who this guy was. The real question they were probably asking is, does Jesus? Does he not know who this guy is? I'm getting this picture of them now walking down the street. I don't know how big this area is, but there's a lot of people watching on. They're walking and walk down the street to the house, to Zacchaeus' house, his nice house, his lavish house, the house with all the servants, the house with the best food, the house with the best clothes. You know why? Because everybody that was watching paid for it. All of that corruption led them to walk down to the street, and this was the person that Jesus was choosing to go with, and this was the place and they were going to go. Literally a slap in the face. But this is where the story turns. We read this, that Zacchaeus stands up, he says to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now, I give half my possessions to the poor. He said, if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I love that line, if I have cheated anyone out of anything, he's cheated everybody out of everything. But if I've cheated anybody out of anything, he said, I'm going to pay back 4 times the amount. If they would have taken that guy to court, they probably wouldn't have got 20%. Even if it was legitimate, he went above and beyond. They said, I'm going to give restitution. I am going to pay it back. And Jesus stands up at the end and basically says, listen, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. And then Jesus says, and this is what I really think the main point of Luke's story is all about. It's the idea of who Jesus is and what he cares about. This is what Jesus says. He says, the Son of Man. And Jesus here, he's referring to himself sort of in the third person. Jesus, the Son of Man, has came to seek and save the lost. I have come to seek and save the lost. And that's not the first time we see that. In fact, that's kind of a theme that starts to run in and through Luke's account of who Jesus is. We see this theme right here. I'm going to phrase it up this way. Jesus doesn't write anyone off. That is a common theme we see. Jesus doesn't write anyone off. In other words, he doesn't give up on anyone. Jesus, there is no one to whom he does not extend grace and care with a hope and with a strong belief that that person might connect with God in a new, life-changing way. Jesus doesn't write them off. In fact, sometimes we see that Jesus actually chases them down. Last week, and if you weren't here, you need to go back online and watch it. Last week, we picked up a story where Jesus was telling parables. And Jesus told 3 short stories to a group of onlookers. He talks about a shepherd who has 100 sheep. He lost one. And what did he do? He basically abandoned 99 and found the one, chased it down. There was a woman who had these coins, and she lost a coin. And the woman turned her house upside down until she found that coin. And then in kind of that final story, that final parable, we see the prodigal son, right? We see a dad who had 2 sons and he lost one. And the son went away. But the father what? He never stopped hoping. He never stopped waiting. He never stopped watching for that son to return. You see, Jesus doesn't write anyone off. And I think it's interesting, those parables, actually, when you think about the parables, we keep hearing about the prodigal son, right? We don't even have a name. You never get a name. You know why? Because it's just a story. It's a nameless, faceless, generic placeholder. The prodigal son is an idea. But Zacchaeus, he's the real thing. He is the living, breathing example of that story come true in real life. Listen, no one gets written off. Nobody gets written off because they're not beyond reach. They're actually not discounted. They're not set aside. They're never given up on. Zacchaeus in a moment feels like a wee little man. To everybody else, he's a corrupt tax collector. But no, he's a man on the road to transformation. And his life was ever changed because he encountered what? The real Jesus. The real Jesus. And I would say, Zacchaeus, it's a feel-good story. It really is. It's a feel-good story. Why? Because we like to see things restored. I do. We want to see something get redeemed, and it does. And in God's eyes, I think what happened at that day in Jericho, I think God would say that's a win. That's a win. You sometimes wonder, like, what is on God's heart? And God would say, that is a win. Jesus would say, that's a win. I have come to seek and save the lost. And some of you in this room, you recognize, yes, that's a win. You know why? Because you resonate with the story. Some of you resonate very closely with the story. Some of you remember what it felt like to be written off spiritually. Some of us more than others. Maybe you say, man, I had a history, and if you knew my history, if you knew the things I've done, in fact, if you know the stuff that I've done that no one knows that I've done, and maybe you know your moral bankruptcy, and maybe you have felt the weight and guilt of sin, and yet there was some day, some moment, somewhere, somehow, some person, you encountered that real Jesus. And in some way, Jesus looked at you and he said, I'm coming to your house today. I want to come to your house today. And you welcomed him in that moment. And because of that, what happened? Your life's never been the same. Maybe you love the story of Zacchaeus because it's your story. It's your story. It is the true heart of God and who he is to us. That really is the overarching message of the story of Zacchaeus. But I don't think it's the only thing that we get to pull from this short story. Last week, again, when Jesus was sharing these three parables, we said that he shared these three stories with two different groups of people, and it meant something different for different people. Zacchaeus is the same way. Zacchaeus is a story that's based around Zacchaeus and Jesus, but there's a whole other cast of characters in the story. You saw that, right? There's a whole other cast of characters. It's all the onlookers, everybody else in this city of Jericho. And I said it was a feel-good story. It was a win. But to everybody else who was watching this happen, it didn't feel very good. And to them in that moment, it certainly didn't feel like a win. Maybe you caught that, right? After Jesus goes to the tree and he says, "Come down, I'm coming to your house," what did all the people say? It says they began to mutter. He's gone to be the guest of a sinner. They started muttering. What did the people see? They all saw it. What did they see? They saw Jesus engage with someone that they weren't going to engage with. They saw Jesus attach himself to someone that they were not about to attach themselves to. They saw Jesus associate with a person deeply that they had no plan to associate with. And then Jesus afforded a chance to someone that they were done giving chances to. And when they saw that, it says they muttered. Can I tell you that we don't mutter about things that we agree with? Like, that's not what muttering is. We mutter when we disagree with things. We mutter when we're irritated by something. And I think that crowd in that moment saw that, and they not only disagreed with some of what was happening, they were irritated by what they were participating in and what Jesus was about to do. Listen, Jesus extended a tremendous grace to Zacchaeus. But he did all of that because he had a priority. He had a priority in that moment. And he told it to us. It was to seek and save the lost. And in the face of that, these people muttered. And muttering is actually kind of a common theme. Again, we don't see that just here. We see it in other places. We see it when Jesus is in action. Jesus does some things at times that don't always seem to make sense. Jesus has a way of not always fitting into the natural and cultural framework around him. Maybe you know that. But it challenges us, and we've said this throughout this series, that sometimes Jesus' priority is not always our priority. That can be a challenge for us. Jesus' priority is not always our priority. And anytime we read through different parts of the Bible, today included, it begs this question. Begs the question. It challenges us to consider where we stand and how we feel in relation to where Jesus stands and how he feels. And that comes to life again today, because in this story we see that Jesus never writes anyone off, right? Jesus, there's nobody to whom he's not going to extend grace and care with this hope and the belief that maybe, just maybe, they will connect with God in a new and transformative way. He never writes anybody else off. But here's the question, right? Here's the question. Do we share in that same priority? I'll make it personal. Do I? Do I ever write anyone off? In other words, is there something in me that would cause me to disengage from certain people in my life? Is there something in me that would prompt me to disassociate with certain people, or maybe even certain groups of people around me? Is there something in me that would push me to give up on someone, to not afford them every chance to connect with God in a new and meaningful way? Those are tough questions. You know why they're tough questions? They're tough questions for me. Here's why. Because in an honest moment, I already know the answer. The answer is yes. Yes, I do write people off. Not always intentionally, but I believe it's in there. There are certain people, there are certain groups of people I recognize I don't press into with that same fervor, with that same hope, with that same belief that God might just intercept them and do something amazing in their life. And because that lives in me, I recognize day in and day out, I might miss opportunities to do something that God would want to do. And worse than that, sometimes I might not just miss an opportunity, I might actually become a hindrance. I may actually be the reason, something that stands in the way between that person reconnecting with their Father in heaven. And I don't know if I'm alone in that. Maybe some of you recognize that there's parts of that might still live in you, that there's some of that attitude in our hearts. And I've got to ask myself, you need to ask yourself the question, why? Why? What is that? What is that? Where does that come from? What is going on inside of us, whether it's conscious or maybe just unconscious in our lives, that would cause us to miss opportunities to connect people to God? And I realize the answer for you might be different than it is for me. We have different backgrounds. Everybody's got different experiences. But I think in a generalized way, here's what I think goes on in us. Here's what I think. I think that we struggle to extend grace when we lose sight of God's grace in our own lives. I know that's true for me. We struggle to extend grace when we lose sight of God's grace in our own lives. And again, I'm going to reference last week the story of the prodigal son. It's a very timely reminder. The prodigal son was not an only son. He had two sons. There was an older brother as well. And when this younger brother, the prodigal, comes back home, guess what? It's a win. We know it's a win. The father says it's a win. In fact, the father starts giving him gifts and throws a huge party and has a feast. But the older brother, who is out in the field, he comes back in. He hears all the commotion. He finds out what's actually going on. His lost brother has returned. And what does the older brother say? It says that the older brother became angry, and he refused to go in. He refused to go in. The father went out, pleaded with him, but the older brother said to his father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you. I've never disobeyed your orders. Man, I read between the lines there, this older brother saying, listen, I've done my part. I've done my part. I have performed well. I have followed the rules. I have earned the things that I have. But when this son of yours, think about that for a moment. He doesn't even say my brother, right? He doesn't even reference him. You want to talk writing off. I think the older brother has already long since written off his brother. When this son of yours, who squandered your property with prostitutes and all kinds of other stuff, comes home, what do? You kill the fattened calf for him. Can you feel that attitude from the older brother? I can. And you know why? Because I'd probably feel the same way. I mean, the older brother gets a bad rap for that, but I'm sitting there thinking, man, he points out to the father what I would point out to the father. You seem to have forgotten something, Dad. He screwed up in a big way, in a real way, in an obvious way. And not only that, no one forced him to do it. That was a choice for the younger brother. No one made him steal your inheritance and go do what he did. And the older brother might be thinking, party, what party? Man, I could point out all the ways that he failed. Grace, what grace? Man, my brother should get what he deserves. And if anybody should get something, it should be me. Should be me, right? Deserves to be me, because relative to my brother, he deserves it less than I do. Man, I find some of that, right? I find some of that because we're prone to live like this older brother. Why? Because it is so much easier. It is so much easier to identify and call out the missteps of someone else. Man, it's just that quick. It's that easy. I can tell you what that guy did. I can tell you what she did. I can tell you what they did. It's so easy to call out the missteps of somebody else, to amplify someone else's sin and minimize our own. We can focus on other people's stuff, and what happens? We start to kind of casually kind of ignore some of the stuff that lives in our own life. Kind of a habit. We get maybe a spiritual judgment or maybe a critical spirit toward people, a quick assessment of the wrongdoing of others, a magnification of their stuff. And sometimes it feels warranted, even in our own lives. It feels warranted because we know what they did. But sometimes we have that critical spirit and judgment toward people without even knowing what they've done or what they will do. We start to make assumptions about people because we have past experience. And before long, we have a critical spirit and we cast judgment on people and how they would or would not respond to God just based on how we see them. Sometimes we might even say, man, we write somebody off. I write you off because you're too young. I write them off, they're too old. Sometimes we write people off because of how they talk. We write them off based on the language they use. We write people off based on what they wear, how they look, their political affiliation, write them off. The job they hold, maybe we write them off. We write people off based on just where they live. We write people off because of the people that they connect with. Listen, we can quickly judge, quickly categorize people so easily because we can clearly see, right? At least we think we clearly see who they are. And many times we're actually just assuming who they are. And not only do we see who they are, we get to feel and experience what it is that they do. And sometimes there are certain things that people do that bother us. That's real. And that's legitimate. And there are certain things that people do that bother God. And we know that's real and legitimate. But sometimes we struggle with people who do things that bother us more than others. And I don't know if you do this. Sometimes I do this. Again, subconsciously or consciously, I evaluate certain habits, certain patterns, certain behaviors. And some of those I see as kind of acceptable. Like, yeah, I get it. Others, now that's not acceptable. And we start to be judge and jury on what people do, and we start to determine what we think offends God the most in someone else's life. And then we can crusade against and highlight those things that we think God is probably most offended by. And then we get to amplify their wrongdoing, minimize our own, and decide who gets in and who doesn't. Listen, it's so much easier to identify the misgivings and missteps of someone else, right? We fool ourselves. We fool ourselves into thinking that our sin is not that significant, certainly not as damaging as what they've done. And then we get to withhold grace. Listen, ultimately, we can write people off. We can withhold grace because in our eyes, they don't do it right. Maybe they don't deserve it. But really, the flip side of that is this. Here's the flip side. Somehow we think that we have deserved it. We somehow think that maybe we have earned God's favor. We have earned or deserved the grace that we've been given. And we call out their missteps. We ignore our own. I think the older brother, I don't think he thought the younger brother deserved any of the benefit. But in his heart, he thought he did. I think the older brother thought he did everything right. He said to the father, look, all these years I've been slaving for you, never disobeyed your orders. And my son, the father said, listen, here's the truth of it. You've lost touch with how much grace has been given to you. How much grace has been given to you. My son, the father said, you are always with me. Everything I have is yours. This party, this celebration that I'm throwing for your brother, this heart that I have toward your brother, all of that has been yours. And it is still yours. It's been yours the whole time. And he's not just talking about the stuff. He's not talking about the robe and the ring and the party and all the material stuff. No, the father is saying to the older brother, listen, the same grace that you see me right now extending to your brother, that is the grace that I freely give to you every day you live in my house. That's what I have given you. And that same grace that was given to the one who was wayward, man, that is the same grace that gets given to that person that seems to have not recognized that they've wandered off. The Father's grace is indiscriminate, given to both brothers. Listen, the truth is, in the story of that, everyone has wandered off. That's the truth of it. Everyone's wandered off. Back to the story of Zacchaeus. Guess what? Everyone is Zacchaeus. Everyone is Zacchaeus. You know why? Because while we're in tune with somebody else's wrongdoing, pretty obvious, right? And while you can see what it is they're doing, no one in the story is blameless. You can be Zacchaeus or you can be in the crowd, but the truth is all of us bear the burden of having stepped outside of a right connection with God in some way or another. Everybody stands in the same place. It's clear for Zacchaeus and it's clear for the crowd. Jesus actually has a half-brother. His name is James. James grows up. He becomes a leader in the Jerusalem church. He talks about favoritism with his church, and this is what he says. So he said, whoever keeps the whole law stumbles at just one point, meaning if you can keep all of these commands, all of these laws, you offend God at just one moment, in one way, in one small thing, guess what? You are guilty of breaking all of it. All of it. This is a pass-fail kind of deal. We all stand in a place of need before God. Everybody stands in a place of need before God, and yet all of us get reconciled in the same way. We're all reconciled by that same grace that God gives out. We are all recipients of grace. Jesus came to seek and save the lost. How does he seek and save the lost? By God's grace. The Apostle Paul, the most prolific writer of our New Testament, he talks to the church in Ephesus and he says rightly, we were by nature deserving of wrath. He's not talking to a certain people group. He's talking to the people group. We were by nature deserving of wrath, but because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, he's rich in mercy. He made us alive in Christ when? When we got it right? When we got it together? When we did the work? When we deserved it? No. He made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in our transgressions, in it. It is by grace you have been saved. You see, God approached Zacchaeus in his lostness. That's what threw everybody off. He approached Zacchaeus in his lostness. And you know what? God approaches us in our lostness. It's amazing. It's by grace you have been saved. That's what Paul says. It's by grace you have been saved through faith. It is not of yourselves. It's a gift by God. It is not by work. No one has earned this, so no one can boast about it. No one can boast. Listen, we can never begin to believe that somehow we have earned our foundness, that we have earned what it is that God has actually just freely given to us. Listen, we can't think that because maybe we've obeyed in certain areas, and I hope that you have. Maybe you're walking now in more holiness than you ever have, and I hope that's true. Maybe you know more truth now about who God is than you've ever known in your life. But even in all of that, you can't somehow think that through that process you've garnered some additional favor with God. If we think that we earn what we have, if you think we earn what we have, then we lose sight of God's grace in our lives. And what happens if we lose sight of God's grace in our life? I think we struggle. I think we struggle to extend it to other people. We struggle to extend that grace when we lose sight of how pivotally important it is to us. Listen, we can't write people off because they're too far gone. We cannot write people off because they don't deserve it. All of us are the equal beneficiaries of the grace and mercy of God. It's the story of Zacchaeus. Such a short little story, but it shows us who God is. It reminds us once again what's possible. There's no one in our midst that's too far from the grace of God. And I think it's a feel-good story because the love that God has, it gets extended to everyone. It gets extended to all. Everybody in that town, if they would want it. He entered Jericho that day, and he made an example of the one. That's what he did. He made an example of the one. One man. One lost person, one despised person, one immoral tax collector. But what that crowd doesn't recognize is, again, Jesus was passing through. He just passed through Jericho, but on his way through Jericho, he was headed to Jerusalem. And when he walked into Jerusalem, he didn't leave Jerusalem. Because in Jerusalem, what Jesus did was expose his mission, not just for the one, but for all. And Jesus laid down his life. That is where he died, that is where he was buried, and that is where he was raised again. It became the most magnificent and lasting act that would solidify his ultimate purpose and proclaim to the world that I truly have come to what? Seek and save the lost. Seek and save the lost. And we have an opportunity today to look back at that, see how it has influenced us now. And we get to be the conduits of that grace into our world. You and I get the privilege of being that conduit of grace to the people around us, people who at first glance we might not intuitively want to look at again. We get the opportunity to associate people that we wouldn't always want to associate with. We have to move toward the people that we often move away from, and sometimes we need to afford chances to people that no one else is going to extend a chance to. Because we're all equal beneficiaries of that grace of God. We don't write anyone off. There's no one that Jesus doesn't extend that grace to, with the hope and the fervent belief that maybe, just maybe, they will connect with God in a life-changing way. Listen, as we walk out this week, here's one question I want you to consider. One question I want you to consider, and it's this. Is there anybody right now in your life that maybe you need to see through fresh eyes? That you maybe you need to look at in a fresh way. It might be someone in your family. It might be someone under your own roof. It's somebody close to you. It may be a neighbor. It may be somebody in your sports league. It may be somebody in the cubicle next to you, on the line with you, somewhere at work. Students, it may be somebody at the lunchroom with you, someone at recess that you can't stand. I don't know. But is there anybody in your life right now where you need to see them through fresh eyes? Maybe you've made some assumptions or are continuing to make assumptions about that person or people or groups of people that would cause you to push away from them. Lean into those assumptions to see what you don't know. Learn, relate. Are there certain patterns of behavior that are pushing you away from someone? I understand that. I understand it. But at times, are there times you need to lean in, though, engage, and associate with that person in a meaningful way? I mean, I wonder what would happen if every person, I often about me and you, if every person that would bump into us as individuals, or would bump into us even just as a church, what would happen if they encountered the response of the real Jesus? If they knew that we would approach them and see them through the lens of the real Jesus, would it change the way that they encounter God? I think it would. I think it would. And no doubt, as we walk out and God empowers us to do that, when we remember the grace we've been given and we give it away, I think it will change lives. change lives. Again, not through our power, but truly through the power of God's grace. And so that's our challenge this week. All right, let me pray for us.